Okay, hello everybody. My name is Regina Hawker, pronouns she, they, and I am here with some of my fellow wonderful members of the Disability Coalition of Cal Poly to do a presentation on disability education. I am a third year kinesiology major. I have long brown hair and I'm currently wearing a gray blazer. We're going to be doing these verbal image descriptions to make sure that you all have an idea of what we look like, and this is another way to promote accessibility. So first of all, our presentation schedule is going to start out with um, a chunk about disability education, such as defining disability, talking about identity first versus person first language and why people have a preference and how to be inclusive while using that. And then we're going to discuss different types of disabilities and thus access with them. Then we're going to talk about ableism and define it, and then discuss the importance of accessibility, and finally wrap up with some key points on how to be an ally and how to promote accessibility.
Hi, my name is Hannah Heath. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am wearing a white shirt and I have magenta hair and I have just kind of a white wall with a bunch of artwork in the background. So first we wanted to start off by defining disability. So disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So this is the official legal definition of disability. As you can see, it's quite broad and it does span everything from like a chronic illness to something like a mental health condition, such as a anxiety disorder, and also covers everything from physical disabilities like people who use wheelchairs or are paraplegics, or people who might utilize even glasses or hearing aids. And we will be going deeper into what a disability is, but this is kind of just your basic definition to get you started. So, oftentimes people aren't sure what language to use when discussing disability. So, there are two main ways to talk about disability. One is identity first, and one is person first. And they're both valid and they're both used for very different reasons. So, identity first language places the disability first to embrace the disability as an important part of who they are. So, this means referring to people as a disabled person. I myself use identity first language because it does center the word disability and it makes people start thinking about that word, and it kind of destigmatizes the term. Other people use person first language, which places an emphasis on personhood rather than making disability a primary and defining characteristic. And so this means using the term person with a disability. And this really does kind of put the focus on disabled people and kind of tries to push back against this idea that disability has to be the defining, like, central part of somebody's being. So those are the two language usages. If you're not sure what a disabled person prefers, you can just listen to how they talk about themselves in their community and mirror that when discussing these topics with them, or you can just ask them which ones they prefer. All right, so let's talk about some disability statistics. 10% of all Cal Poly students are registered with the Disability Resource Center. Not every student with a disability is actually registered with the DRC. So that means that while 10% of Cal Poly students are disabled, that number is higher than that because there are students who are not registered with the DRC for a variety of reasons. Outside of Cal Poly, 1 in 4 adults in the U.S. have some type of disability, which means we are a very large minority group in America. We make up about 25% of the population. Some disabilities are visible, some are invisible, and some are in between. So it's impossible to look at someone and be able to tell whether they are disabled, which I believe Reina is going to discuss next.
Thanks for that. My name is Reina. I identify with the pronouns she, her, and I am a girl with dark black brown hair and a ponytail and a white shirt and glasses. I'm going to be talking to you guys a bit about visible versus invisible disabilities and what that really means. So a visible disability is something that you can see. So for example, today I'm wearing glasses. Or if somebody is walking with crutches or using a wheelchair or has a hearing aid in their ear, you can see that. And that usually indicates to you that that individual has some sort of disability. However, not all disabilities are visible to the naked eye. So, an example of an invisible disability could be something like a sensory disability or a cognitive or intellectual disability. For example, a lot of us know what dyslexia is, and you can't tell that somebody has dyslexia from looking at them. They would have to tell you they have it for you to know. A mental health disability can also be invisible, so you might not know that someone's really struggling with major depressive disorder, but they might be, and that could be disabling for them. Or various chronic illnesses. Many chronic illnesses do not require a wheelchair or hearing aid, and so you can't tell that somebody is living with a chronic illness and has a disability from that, but they do. So then let's talk about permanent versus temporary and fluctuating disabilities. So permanent disabilities are something that is a disability that will have permanence in someone's life. So they're not going to lose their disability. They're not going to grow out of it. They're not going to be cured from it. It's just a part of their life. Whereas a temporary disability is something that's not expected to persist. For example, your limb is not going to be broken forever. So a cast will come off and you will be able to use your arm again. Or some certain injuries can also present as temporary disabilities or an impairment from recovering from surgery. For example, someone might use a wheelchair or crutches after surgery, but once they have healed, they will not use that anymore. So disabilities can also fluctuate. So they don't have to always be present in that exact same way every day. So the symptoms can fluctuate. So if someone has a chronic illness, perhaps they could have fatigue and one day be feeling a lot better and another day be feeling a lot more tired. Or they could have a morning where they feel really great and then in the afternoon not be feeling very good. So it's very unpredictable in terms of disabilities that fluctuate. A lot of times people who have them cannot decide when they're going to be feeling good or not feeling good. And some disabilities can also be visible from one day and then be invisible the next. For example, some people, such as myself, are ambulatory wheelchair users. So some days when I am not feeling as well, I will be using a wheelchair, and other days I will be walking. So it might be confusing to some people who assume that someone who uses a wheelchair has to be permanently disabled and maybe doesn't use their legs. And there are people like that, and there's also people that use a wheelchair and then walk. So that's just one example, but there's many other ways in which people can have visible and invisible disabilities. So it kind of branches between that and being somewhat visible sometimes. So let's talk about ableism next. Ableism is an emerging buzzword. It has been used a lot more in the last 4 to 5 years. And ableism is a word to describe the system of oppression, like racism or sexism, that benefits non disabled people at the expense of disabled people. So it is characterized by the belief that people with disabilities need to be fixed or they cannot function as full members of society. So, also like racism or sexism, it kind of is based on the whole idea that someone who has a disability is not as worthy or has less worth than someone who does not have a disability. For example, someone who has contributed a lot to our world, who had a pretty profound disability that was visible, was Stephen Hawking. So he had a disability, and I think we can all agree that Stephen Hawking had a lot of worth for us and contributed a lot to our world. So a lot of times we don't like to think in that way directly, but there's a lot of systemic ableism and ableism that we don't even realize we hold toward people with disabilities. So we might not think, oh, Stephen Hawking is lesser because he was in a chair and couldn't speak very well toward the end of his life. But we might think that sometimes without overtly thinking. So ableism, like racism and sexism, is systemic. It's in our systems, it's everywhere, and oftentimes it's difficult to recognize because it's been so normalized. So ableism is really important to challenge, just like we're challenging racism and sexism in these times. So it's very important that we examine our systems and ask ourselves, are these ableist? So then let's go on to why accessibility is important. So this plays into what I was saying earlier. But accessibility is important because, First of all, college is hard. And for someone who has a disability, it can be even harder, especially if there is not accessibility. Some people like to describe being disabled as having a different need that the world does not accommodate. For example, if everybody was unable to walk and there was one person that walked, it might not fit the needs of everybody else. But since everybody's able to walk and certain people aren't able to walk, it's flip-flopped. So accessibility kind of bridges this gap. It creates equity. So accessibility is important because we have values at Cal Poly of equity and inclusion and diversity. And disability is diversity, and we need to include disability in our diversity. So having accessibility for individuals with disabilities so that they can participate in things and access resources that everybody else can access, that is part of inclusiveness. That's part of our values at Cal Poly, and it's something that we often need to audit and make sure that we are embodying in our systems. So accessibility also helps to support intersecting identities. So disability is a minority identity, as are things like race or ethnicity, and also things like identifying in the LGBTQ plus community. So an individual might be disabled and be an ethnic minority, or an individual might be disabled and be a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And it's important to remember that we want to represent both of their identities or all of their identities rather than just one that might be more commonly recognized. And then lastly, accessible events benefit everyone. So you might not actually identify as having a disability or be considered to have a disability, but maybe having closed captioning on a video will actually help you, even though you don't have a registered disability, because it helps you to hear somebody better or focus on something better, or perhaps an image description can help you to actually understand the purpose of an image. So there's many different things where accessibility doesn't just benefit one individual, but can actually benefit the greater group of people. And it's really just something that we should have. Everybody should have. It just makes things better. So accessibility is very important, especially at Cal Poly in our resources, so that we can have everybody be able to access things. So how to be an ally to the disability community? Firstly, it's important to follow the accessibility first rule. Always plan for accessibility before you begin planning for anything else. So this doesn't mean that we're going into things going, accessibility is more important than your event. But accessibility is an important aspect of your event. When you are planning an event, the first thing you should ask yourself is this accessible? Is there a way that we can make this accessible? Is there a way that we can make sure that everybody can come and participate? Then it's also important to believe people when they disclose a disability to you. So for example, if somebody has an invisible disability that you never knew they had, do not accuse them of faking it. Oftentimes, if someone is disclosing a disability to you, that is a personal thing and they would not be faking it. There's no gain for that. So it's important to believe people when they tell you they have a disability. So also it's important to follow the nothing about us without us mantra. Education and decisions pertaining to the disability community should always be led by disabled people. It is important to elevate the voices of disabled people and not to speak over them. They truly do know what is best for themselves. So it's important to listen to the experts in the experience. And lastly, it's important to listen and respect people when they request accommodations. So if somebody has a disability that they disclose and ask for an accommodation, it is important to make sure they have that accommodation.
If you want more information about disability awareness, education, accessibility, or would like to learn about resources available to disabled Cal Poly students, you can follow the Disability Coalition of Cal Poly on Instagram, and that's our tag. It's at disabilitycoalition.cp.